I'm going to post the reminder about the lucky draw one last time, just so that everyone who hasn't done so yet can do so by 3 o'clock when the link closes. And then I think we're ready to start. So we are in our last session now for the day before we go into the lucky draw and the final wrap-up session for the day. I think it was a lovely time. I'm so happy. I'm energized. Normally by this time of the day, one is tired and bored to death. But the program, the presenters have outdone themselves and really kept us on our toes and energized us throughout the day. So, Rebecca, I think you have an audience that is awake and keen to participate, even though it's the last one of the day. So, Rebecca, thank you so much for coming to talk to us about saving time while teaching online. Over to you.
Thank you. All right. Let me just jump in just to introduce myself. I'm Rebecca Hogue. I'm a lecturer at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, specifically in the instructional design program. So I teach instructional design. So you're learning solutions architects or you're learning solutions, I don't know what you call them today, are generally my students. I've been teaching instruction. I've been doing instructional design for more than 20 years, but I've been teaching it for more than 5. I'm also a podcaster. I podcast at Demystifying Instructional Design. I live in Nova Scotia, Canada. So although I teach at the University of Massachusetts, Boston in the States, I live in Canada and I teach 100% online. I've actually only been to the campus once. And you can see my Twitter and LinkedIn. My Twitter profile is at the bottom of every slide. So that's who I am. And the next thing I want to do is ask a few questions about who you are. So there's a Menti link that is going to show up in the chat as well. And I will share the Menti presentation if I can figure out how to do that. Here we go. Present. There we go. And so my first question to you is, how long have you been teaching online? Looks like we've got some expertise in the room. This is going to be awesome because this is a collaborative session. So I'm going to be asking you to contribute to a Google Doc if you wish throughout the session. There's a whole bunch of people who haven't answered the Menti yet, so we'll see if anyone else wants to jump in. It's okay to say I haven't yet or less than 1 year. I never know how long to leave these things. All right, let's move on to the next question. The next question I have for you is, what do you spend the most time doing when you're teaching online? By the way, if you see me looking sideways, that's because I'm looking at the pictures, although I think I'm the only one who should have my camera on, so. Ooh, engaging with students. Responding to queries, both academic and logistical. Preparation. Grading. Yeah, that's a big one for me too. Trying to interact. Reading and responding to student posts. Far too much time doing corrections to silly errors. Marking. Those are some great answers. And so I have divided my presentation. So I'm going to stop this for now and jump over to my other part. First of all, start with I never know where the present button is. There it is. Okay. There's a collaborative Google Doc that I have started. I have put my notes in for sort of my things, but I would like to encourage people to either add to the things that I've said, but also add to the things that you think right? What are the tips that you have, and suggestions that you have? And so the idea is at the end of this presentation, and the session, we'll leave with a resource that we all can have and share about teaching online. So the link to the Google Doc is there for anyone who wants to follow along in the Google Doc. So I've divided this presentation and workshops already into 3 areas, and it has more to do with timing than anything. And so I've divided it up into like course design. These are all of the things that you might do before you actually start teaching. And then the act of teaching itself, which is that interacting with students and such, and then the act of marking, which in some ways I think of marking as teaching, but there are specific things that I do to help speed up the marking process. And so let's start with some course design. And so again, I'm just going to share my tips, and then we'll have an opportunity for people to share their tips. The first tip, which is sort of the biggest one that every instructional designer will tell you, design it first and then implement. Blackboard or whatever LMS you're using is generally not a good place to design. And if you try designing in Blackboard, you'll end up having to edit too much. You'll end up having to go back and clean up the stuff that you don't want anymore, move things around, and it becomes very time consuming. So I will often just use a Google Doc or a Word doc and go through the process, the design process, figuring out my course goals, figuring out what each lesson is going to be, what resources or contents I'm going to use in each lesson before I ever get to Blackboard and actually entering it into Blackboard. So designing first is one of the big tips I have. Preview videos at 2 times speed. I don't know why this took me as long as it did. I found this little app, vSpeed Controller's a relatively new one that I'm using, and it's just a plug into Chrome, and it will speed up any video. And so when I'm going through this, for example, we have LinkedIn Learning at our university, and so when I'm trying to figure out whether or not a LinkedIn Learning module is going to be useful for my students, I watch everything at 2 times or two times plus speed or faster, so that it doesn't take me as long to screen it, and I can go through it because I don't need to learn the material. I just need to know whether the material that's being presented is valid for my students. And so I go through these things at much faster pace, and that allows me to save a lot of time choosing what material is going to be the material that I'm going to use. I also reuse a lot. Like I do use a lot from resources that my students already have. So I preview videos on YouTube as well, again, at 2 times speed or more, depending on how slow they talk. This is an interesting one. Record audio for slides, not a talking head. So Mayer has principles of multimedia learning, right? He's done a whole bunch of research in multimedia learning. And his 12th principle talks about how humans do not necessarily learn better from a talking head video. So having your picture on the screen doesn't necessarily increase learning. And although I said the exception to this one is at the very beginning of the course, your first presentation should have a picture, because that's related to social presence more so than it's related to speeding up the process. But my regular quote unquote lectures, and I lecture in VoiceThread, which is a tool that lets me do one screen at a time. And the nice thing about this is when I go from one semester to another, if I need to change anything around, I only need to change the audio. If I were to use video, it would be very obvious to my students when I'm flipping things because my hairstyle might have changed or my clothes, like trying to mimic your appearance multiple times becomes really hard, and then it becomes really disjoint to students if they're watching your video and your appearance is constantly changing. And so by recording audio only, that makes it much easier, and it doesn't actually hinder student learning. So there's a benefit for, yeah, it's a huge time-saving tip. And record for each individual slide. So I remember there was a time where, I would try to do, try to do each individual. I used to try to do the entire presentation in one take, right? And so you go, try to do the whole thing and do one long audio thing, which was just horrible because, again, it doesn't let you switch out one screen in the next semester. And so by keeping all of your audio to one slide at a time, it makes it really easy to pull one out from one semester and put one in. It's a fair bit of work on the first semester you teach it, but it saves you a whole lot of time the next time you're going through. And it lets you pull a slide between different classes. So if you have the same material you need to present in 2 classes, but in different contexts, you can pull out specific slides with audio. You can do this with, I use VoiceThread because my university has it. I did a little experiment with my students last semester, and I converted all of my presentations into a video lecture using Camtasia with a quiz at the end, all built in, and my students learned less. I was really surprised at just how much my students didn't get when I put it in a single video. VoiceThread lets them control one screen at a time, so they can watch a screen, and if they don't get it, they can play it back again, or they move on to the next screen after they've had time to process the one that you just presented. And that, it slows their learning a little bit, but it actually worked so much. I was just amazed at the difference in uptake when I tried that. And this is something I've recently learned to do, is to use a screen reader to proofread content. Because, our computers now all come with screen readers. And for me, I've got it all set up that I just hit, I think it's Option Escape will just play what's on the screen. So I can just bold something or highlight something with my mouse and then just do an Option Escape, and it reads it, and I can control the speed so it reads it really fast. But by listening to it, I can pick up when I'm doing typos. The number of times I type instruction design instead of instructional design, that kind of thing, I won't see it. But listening to the screen reader it does that. And I find that's faster than trying to read things in backwards order or all the other sort of tricks. So for me, I've found that using a screen reader to proofread content, and it has the added bonus of, if you have anything weird in there that might affect accessibility, it'll pick it up as well. So that's kind of it gives you a chance to do a bit of an accessibility check as well. Okay, and so that's what I have for teaching. And so now we have another Menti question. So time to jump over into Menti. I'm seeing a question there, and I will jump to that in just a moment. Let me get this Menti back up and running on the next. So if I go present and jump to the next screen, so you get the actual question. There we go. What types of things do you do to save time in course design? And Derek has a question. Designing first is key. Yes, most definitely. But synchronous, asynchronous, on campus, off campus, or screen size of users also makes a huge impact on your design choices, for sure. How do you design first for at least 2 different modalities? That is a great question. And that's always been, we learned a lot about that during the remote, in COVID timing, but I'm not an expert in that area, in particularly because I teach 100% online, and I've been teaching 100% online well before COVID. So I haven't ever had to teach face-to-face. So I can't tell you between the physical on and off campus being there. I think that that's a really tough nut to crack. What I do tell people for sure is try to design to the modality. And so choose your activities that use the modality as best you can. And so if you know you're going to be online, then there's certain things that work better online, and other things that like we're getting students to work at a collaborative Google Doc. Works great in an online setting. It might work in a face-to-face setting, but not as well. synchronous and asynchronous. That's an interesting one. If you get taught thrown between the two of them, I don't do very much synchronous as well. So I'm pretty much a I do 1 hour a week synchronous. My tip for synchronous, if you can get students talking to each other, you'll save a lot of time. And I'll talk about that one in the sort of next area when I talk about teaching, because students love to talk to each other, and that saves you a lot of time. I'm not seeing anything. Has anybody typed anything in here? Or is there a problem? Can somebody send a test message anyway? Linda, do you see this? Oh, there we go. Templates. What things do you, yeah, templates using the same things. An integrated writing developed how Scrivener. Oh, yes. I actually used to use Scrivener a lot for my course designs. I used to have all, I had like each semester, I had a Scrivener file for each course, and then each semester I could just create a new folder. And that let me find all of my old resources, and it lets you sort of organize things in a great way. Yeah, I agree. That's a great tool. Try to remember not to say good morning. Yeah, in videos, that's actually very important. Try to avoid references to seasons. Yeah, you've got it in here, seasonal aspect, public holidays. I actually also try to avoid mentioning previous or next, because sometimes I change the order of my lectures. And if I change the order of them, what was previous last semester might be next this semester. And so trying to contain the videos into just that one session sort of saves a lot there. A course with mostly, so clone courses over several times and made changes to the cloned site. Over time, the file structure, yeah. I actually, and you need to start fresh again. Yeah, I find that that's one of the biggest challenges is if I copy last semester's and just do a direct course copy into the next semester, I can do that once or twice. But by time number 3, I start with a clean course shell and then update it. But there's also another reason to do that is because your default course shell probably changed, right? So generally what happens is if you just copy over, you'll miss some of the nuanced changes that your templates, your default template would have. And so then importing it module by module also gets rid of a bunch of the baggage that comes in, because you end up bringing in a whole bunch of files you're not using. Is there anything else in here? I'm getting that one. Okay. Cool. All right. Well, thank you, everyone who did jump in onto this Menti. I thought that that was sort of great. Great ideas. And so, yeah, I'm just doing a time check here. Okay. Present. There we go. Next one I have is teaching. So some tips for speeding things up whilst teaching. Not speeding things up, saving time. During sync, use breakout rooms. So I do a couple of different things when I have sync sessions. I don't have sync sessions very often. I have like 1 hour a week. So I'm not trying to do 3-hour sync sessions. I think that that's an interesting design challenge. But anyways, and I make the most use of sync I can. So I use sync as a way for students to interact with each other or for me to bring in special guests. I don't lecture during sync sessions because a lecture is better done as a recording. Bringing people together, you have that opportunity. What's nice about breakout rooms is at least my students love talking to each other. So I can give them a problem and send them off into a breakout room for 15 minutes. And during that 15 minutes, I can then mark discussion forums or read other things. And so I'm actually doing that multitasking while they're doing the breakout rooms. And the students come back and they love it. Like I can do an entire hour where all it is students going into breakout rooms. They come back, they share a couple of key aha moments, and I send them back into a breakout room. And then come back, and at the end, they all say they learned so much and they loved it. And I spent very little time making that happen. And so I think that that's actually a particularly useful tool for sync if you've got the ability to do it. Time-saving features in the learning management system. So get to know a few of the features in your learning management system. And I can only tell you about Blackboard easily because that's the one I teach in. But I know for the discussion forums, one of the things they have is this collect button. And so you can click it and it'll show you everything that's not been read. Or you can show everything where they've replied to you specifically. Now, I don't do a lot I'm not very involved in my discussion forums. I scan them, I jump in now and then, but not very often. I find that if, as an instructor, if you spend too much time in the discussion forums, it actually discourages students from talking to each other. And so I really try and let them that space, but I jump in if I see anything incorrect or anything where, occasionally I'll jump in just so that they think I'm looking. And that's part of the presence of, they just need to think you're there. Subscribe to important discussion forums. This is one I don't know why it took me so long to figure out, but we have in all of our courses a Q&A discussion forum for the instructor. I obsessively read my emails, but I don't always log into Blackboard. And I was spending so much time, even if it's 15 minutes a day, having to log into Blackboard just to see if my students had questions. And then I discovered, hey, I could just subscribe to the discussion forum, the Q&A discussion forum. So I subscribe to it, and anytime a student asks me a question, I get an email. I see the email a lot faster because that just happens to be my workflow. I see the email a lot faster. That email then saves me, then I know to go in, but it means I don't have to necessarily log in every day to see if there are questions. If I know my students are working on things that, there are times when they're working on assignments or working on team stuff that they're not actually in Blackboard. And the only reason they go in is to ask a question. I don't need to go in every day to check for questions anymore. And that's been a huge time saver for me. The other one is the rubric tool. And I don't, for a variety of reasons, don't provide detailed rubrics to my students because I think it stifles creativity. But I do use the tool in marking. Actually, I'll talk about that one more when we get to the marking because this is more about teaching. And, here's sort of one of my tips. You don't need to spend all your time online. You just need to look like you do. I actually use Calendly for office hours. I stopped saying, okay, I'm available for this hour. And I just give my students a link to Calendly that lets them book a 15-minute appointment in my calendar. Usually the appointments are 5 minutes. Usually I get there, I log in, they ask a question or two, they get clarified, they're happy, and then they go away. I actually find that students use this a lot more than they did when I had, book, office hours by appointment or whatever. They didn't use that very often, but I find that they do use this one and I encourage it. And so I have a lot more interactions with my students that way. I prioritize student emails. So I have different email than my personal email. And so I always prioritize that. So they, again, get that sense of quick response. They sense that I'm always there. Subscribe to the Q&A, respond to students at different times of day. It's just sort of an interesting trick. Again, that makes them think you're always there. So if sometimes they get a response in the morning and sometimes the evening, it's just sort of a sense of presence. Be extra present the day before an assignment is due. I remember being a learner online, and was one of the most frustrating things was making assignments due Sunday at midnight and the professors not working on the weekend. And then, as much as we want students to be proactive, and my students are instructional designers and they're usually mid-career professionals, they still need that. They need to know that they can reach you that day before the assignment is due. And then let students know when you're going to be away. So if I know I'm traveling, if I know I'm going to have a delay to my emails, I let the students know that in advance. And so we'll jump back to Menti for more questions, and that will give me a chance to read what's been happening in the discussion forum or in the chat, because I'm not very good at reading chat while I'm talking. So I'm going to take a look at what's going on over here and give you a chance to answer. What types of things do you do to save time when you're teaching? Yeah, and Derek mentions a comment about setting up a portfolio of stable content, and it takes so long, and that is so true. I try, and it's actually about staying organized with your content. Right. So trying to figure out file systems and ways to keep your audio file and your image together in the same place, so that if you make a minor change to an image, if the audio file still works, you don't have to re-record it. That kind of thing takes an organization. I'm not the greatest at it. I'm a searcher, not a they talk about some people are file people, really good at filing. Other people are good at searching, and I'm much more of a searcher than a filer, so I don't file things very well, but I can usually find things via search. Over prepare, open all tabs before the session. Yeah. And that's another one of those interesting things if you're using breakouts, because if you get your students into breakouts, then you have that time to set up for the next part of the session. We split the discussion forum to have a separate space for students to chat with one another and tell them we're not going to check there. I call that the cafe. I usually have a discussion forum that's called the cafe. It used to be they would call it the pub, but that's not actually culturally good. And so usually the coffee shop works nicely for everybody. And I let them use that for that. The tool that we used for the social time, actually, I think could be a very interesting one for students. Yeah, class size. Class size plays a lot. And again, I teach smaller classes. So over prepare, let's see what else we got here. Group assignments, where students take the lead. I actually do group content presentations. And so I actually will, for example, have my students do a presentation on content, but also have them design an activity that the other students have to do. So that means that I don't have to design that activity that the other students need to do. I make them design the activity as part of their assignment. So their assignment is not just doing a presentation, it's a presentation and some kind of activity that causes their their peers to have to integrate the material. So that actually that saves me a lot of time when, you know, I do that especially when there's a lot of choice, like when I have like sometimes I'll have like 5 weeks where and I have like 8 options for content and I don't know which ones to do. That's where I go to the students and say, okay, which ones do you want? Which group wants to present which? And I can let them take the lead on a lot of that. Save responses to frequently asked questions. And I'll mention a tool that I use for that, so that when it comes later on in the next run, yeah. And I noticed too, once you teach the same course a few times, you know what the common questions are. And I actually try and preempt a bunch of them by providing the answers before they even get asked. Although sometimes that's not the greatest pedagogically, it really depends. Ghost text, I don't know what ghost text is. That one. Okay, let's I'll jump onto the last bit and then we can go into an open Q&A and an open sharing. So I don't know that the questions need to all be directed at me. So some marking tips. Design assignments you want to mark. If you have a chance to choose, to really, figure out what you're going to enjoy doing and marking. Like I do a lot of reflective assignments and a lot of project assignments. So my students do a lot of projects. Well, that's the nature of what I teach. But if I can get my students to do a reflective assignment on, tell me what you learned, I am fascinated by that. So I enjoy reading it. And if I can get away with that, that is, yeah, one of my big tips. Playing video assignments at 2 times speed. So I often allow my students to submit in any media they want. So they can submit written or they can submit a video if they want, or an audio file. And again, my students are at UMass Boston. So that region and their dialect tend to speak slowly. So I actually speak too fast for a lot of people. And so playing their assignments at fast speed lets me sort of get through that. And screencast for feedback. Screencast-O-Matic's an inexpensive option. I've got several different options for that. But again, if it's a project, if I can screencast it and I can look at a screen, record what my feedback is, hit pause, go to the next screen, I can take a quick look and then record my feedback. Students really like that video feedback, and it saves me a whole lot of time because I don't have to type it all up and I don't have to figure out how to coordinate the two things. And so for me, that's been a huge time saver as well. And I don't worry when I'm doing that kind of feedback and only one student's going to do it. I don't worry too much about audio quality. I know I get pretty decent audio quality by default. And so I don't worry about, doing editing and cleaning up my audio files and all of that. I do that a lot more for my lectures, but I don't do it for individual feedback. I don't worry about the ums and ahs when I'm giving feedback, but pausing and going to different screens really helps reduce the amount of ums and ahs. I use a tablet and a pen to write in the margins of papers. So when they submit a paper, I download it all and we're on OneDrive. So I just have a OneDrive that feeds directly into my iPad in the iAnnotate app. And then I can just pick it up and I can read it. And then I can write in the margins like the old-fashioned way I used to mark papers. And what's nice about this is that I can do this without having to sit in front of my monitor. So it gives me the time. I can do it from anywhere. I can be sitting in a lawn chair out in the yard enjoying the sun and doing it. The other thing is the tip for this one is to I'm doing the motion with my hands to pinch to make to zoom out, right, and then you can zoom back in again, and that allows you to write smaller text, like for it to be smaller, but it's still easier to write and to write it where it's easier to read. I use a screen reader. Again, I use my screen reader a lot. iAnnotate, which is the app I use on my iPad, also lets me highlight text and have the iPad speak it. And so if I find that I'm starting to fall asleep while marking papers, I move into that mode. I change into the screen reader, having it read me mode. And again, it's really good for proofreading because it will pull out any of those well, it won't play. You'll hear it and you'll know that it's, missing a word or missing a letter or whatever, which you might not notice if you're just reading. And then my tool of choice, Text Expander. One of the best things ever for common information. I tend to give a lot of the same feedback over and over again. And so when I type and I have a certain keystroke thing, and the example I put in here is feed 2, then it writes this out. And so I don't have to keep typing it over and over again. I have snippets recorded for common feedback, common questions, common answers, common directions. I have one that's called Zoom, which will sends out my Zoom room email link, right? Like anything like that. It's a super useful tool. I think that yeah, It's one of the few that I will actually say is worth its money. And then I have one last Menti question, and that's the end of my slideshow. And then we can go into Q&A. But let's do one more, which is the marking. What do you do to save time whilst marking? I find an LMS WYSIWYG interface clunky, ghost. It allows you to write in an editor and link this directly to the text editor. Yeah, peer marking. Yeah, you know what I do is I do peer reviews. Like, so I have my students do peer reviews, and then I have them hand things in after the peer review. So they do a peer review, they get a chance to fix everything that their peers came up with, and then they hand it in to me. So by the time it gets to me, a lot of the minor errors and issues have been resolved through the peer review. And so that means that the quality of what I get is much better, and I don't have to deal with the poor quality stuff. A well-constructed rubric. And so for me, again, rubrics are an interesting thing, and it really depends on the type of class you have and the type of pedagogy you're using. So I'm in a very lucky position where I can give all my students an A, and I can do mastery grading. And so for me, I use the rubric tool, but I use it as a checklist for common feedback. So it lets me go in and say, okay, I know that, for example, every discussion forum is worth 5 points, and you get 3 points for your original post and 1 point for each of your responses. As an example, so I just created a rubric for that. And so if a student, you know, if they do everything, they can just get their 5 points. I don't need to give them any feedback. But if they missed something, I can just open the rubric tool and click on the things that they missed and move it on. And that saves me a lot of time from having to write, you know, you're missing this or you're missing that. It lets you provide focused feedback. Sharing your rubrics lets your students know what you expect, so it's good pedagogy as well. But it's really hard to do good rubrics. It's not an easy task, and it's one of those things that takes time. But for me, if I give my students a rubric with too much detail, they will do exactly the rubric. But because the nature of some of the courses I teach are very creative courses, if I give them a rubric, they'll follow the rubric. If I don't give them a rubric, they'll create something 10 times better than I ever thought they could. And so my students blow me away when I don't give them that detail. If I give them that detail, they'll work to the minimum. And so that's one of the reasons why I don't use them for a lot of my projects, but I do use them. They are a marking tool, right? They're not so much an assignment tool. Design questions with really detailed formative feedback so that students can figure out why they were right or wrong. Try to move from disposable to renewable assignments. That's basically around what we are. Try to there's a lot of interesting discussion about assignments in AI right now, and about how AI can write really bad papers for students. But there's some really great tips for how to avoid writing assignments like that. And part of that is having assignments tied to something contextual, which would make it less renewable, I think. Although it depends on how you word it. There's lots of interesting challenges that way. Okay, I'm going to stop my screen share and open up for questions. And I think this is where my moderator is going to help me because I don't know quite how to do that.
Yes. Okay. So we can either take questions in the chat room, or if you want to put your hand up and then you'll turn your mic on and your video if you wish, and we can take some questions.
I also want to encourage people to write in the Google Doc. And I should pop over there and see if anybody has. But yeah, I would encourage people to add tips to the Google Doc as well.
Rebecca, I have a question. Earlier on, you were talking about the instructional designers and that you are teaching, and that you always encourage people to build first before design first before they build. But is the building something that in your institution the instructional designers do, or is it something that the subject matter experts need to do? I'm always wondering which is best.
Yeah, and it really depends, but in my institution, it's all up to the instructor. And so the instructional designers will work with an instructor to teach them how to do it. And they'll work with instructors to help them design better courses and design alignments and assessments to make sure that assessments align with the learning objectives and that kind of stuff. And then they'll teach them how to do it in the learning management system and teach them tricks for things like, knowing that you never click here and make that the link, right? Like accessibility issues. They teach a lot of that kind of stuff, but it's up to the instructor themselves to put it into the learning management system.
Yeah, I'm asking because we get quite a lot of resistance from people who say that they're busy, and these are, it's all right to do maybe the first week or two's worth of work, but then thereafter it becomes so repetitive and time consuming that they'd rather ask someone else to do. So yeah, at our institution we also make use of tutors, interns to help us with the drudging building, but we do insist that the lecturers at least design 1 or 2 weeks by themselves with the support, of course, of the instructional designer, just to ensure that they at least familiar with the environment and can make last minute changes and so on.
That's a really great practice. For the people that actually work on campus, and I'm a adjunct, so I don't have any TAs, but I also don't have that many students. But those that do have TAs, I know that when I was working on a PhD, I was one of the TAs, and I know I did a lot of entering things into the learning management system, setting up the courses for my supervisor. And so I do think that that's a good practice. It's great to teach the students so that when they become the professors, especially your PhD students, or your doctorate students, right? When they become the professors, then they already know it.
Right, right. Are there any other questions, colleagues?
Any other tips anyone wants to share?
I do think what you've shared with us was inspirational. I made a couple of notes. I'll have to go and sit down and gather my thoughts after this to see how I can impact, test out all the new things that I've learned about this today. I've never used Text Expander and those kinds of things, and so it's certainly something that I would like to explore. That makes so much good sense. Right, mm-hmm. If there aren't any further questions, we really appreciate your time, Rebecca. I'm wondering, what time of the day is it there in Canada?
It's 10:30 in the morning. Where I am. Okay. I'm almost as far east as you can get, so I'm 1 hour further east than the Eastern time zone, so where most of the people are. Okay. The US doesn't have this time zone, so it's kind of an interestingly weird one.
Yeah, so it's late afternoon for us, and so I think people have been busy all day long and have been taking in a lot. We really appreciate your time, and we thank you for your presentation. It was inspirational. And if there are any further comments, I'm sure we can keep the discussion going on the chat room. Alternatively, I'll close the session now, and then I'll meet you in the final session. My colleagues said that they would allow for another couple of minutes the lucky draw to be open. So if you haven't completed the lucky draw yet and you still want a chance, you're welcome to quickly just hop in there and see if it's still open, and try and put your stuff in there. Otherwise, we'll see you at the wrap-up session at 5 to 4. Thanks, colleagues.
Excellent.